Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
I'm with Chandrashekhar Dasgupta, a former ambassador of India to China and the European Union, someone who served in India's mission in Dhaka in 1972, weeks after a brand new nation called Bangladesh came into being, breaking away from Pakistan with not inconsiderable help from India. And today we are talking about Ambassador Chandrashekhar Dasgupta's second book. The first book was in Kashmir. It's called War and Diplomacy. This is his second book, and it's called India and the Bangladesh Liberation War. So I would urge you, dear viewer, to go out, buy it, get it, put it on your bookshelf, read a paragraph every day, if only to remind you of the epochal events that took place 50 long years ago when Bangladesh came into being, a brand new country in South Asia, and how those events have affected not just our history but that of the world. Mr. Dasgupta, welcome to ThePrint.
Thank you very much. Pleasure.
Let me ask you about the drama of 1971. Give the viewer of ThePrint a little bit of how it all began, and you know, of course, it all ended in December 1971 when Pakistan breaks up.
Well, the thing is, you know, contrary to a widespread belief, India never wanted the breakup of Pakistan right up to the 25th March 1971, when the military instituted that savage crackdown in what was East Pakistan.
Called Operation Searchlight.
Called, yes. We knew that Mujib wanted an independent Bangladesh. What we were hoping for, particularly after the December 1970 elections in Pakistan, which brought, which gave the Awami League a majority of seats in the National Assembly, was that an Awami League government would be formed at the center in Pakistan.
Right.
We thought that this offered the only hope of a breakthrough in India-Pakistan relations as a whole, because so long as the West Pakistan military and civil establishment had a monopoly of power at the center in Pakistan, there was really no hope of a breakthrough.
But of course, Pakistan's martial law dictator, Ayub Khan,
precisely, and
was
it
not
was
impressed.
only when these hopes were finally extinguished, when on the 25th March, as you said, Yahya Khan and the generals decided to institute this murderous crackdown. You know, I mean, hundreds of thousands were massacred and 10 million refugees driven across the border.
But you were in Delhi at the time.
No, I wasn't. I was I was in Rome at that time.
Okay, but you remember the pictures that must have come out from
the newspapers, you know, and after a short while, the world press was publicizing this. We knew what had happened, and the government of India realized that you know, all hopes for a united Pakistan had been buried under a mountain of corpses. And it was at that stage, after the crackdown, when all hope of a transition to democracy in Pakistan as a whole had been extinguished, did India decide to intervene and to assist the Bangladeshis to gain their freedom as early as possible.
So Mrs. Gandhi decided.
Well, Mrs. Gandhi and, of course, the government as a whole decided. There's a myth that Mrs. Gandhi wanted to rush into Bangladesh, you know, to send the army there precipitately in April. It's a myth which was popularized by Manekshaw, Field Marshal Manekshaw, who was a great raconteur, but he didn't have a very clear understanding of the way in which a politician works. There were people in Mrs. Gandhi's cabinet who wanted immediate action. Mrs. Gandhi knew that the army was not prepared because there were no contingency plans.
But who wanted an immediate war?
Unnamed, but there were people in the cabinet. We know this from P.N. Dhar's account. He was secretary to the Prime Minister. And Mrs. Gandhi wanted to deflect this. And therefore she got in Manekshaw to give the army's point of view. and that is what happened.
So she used Manekshaw to deflect dissent in her own cabinet.
Precisely. And she was very clear that it would be disastrous, it would be counterproductive to march into Bangladesh straight away, because her principal advisor, that is to say P.N. Haksa, had pointed out that the principles of non-interference in the affairs of other countries, of territorial integrity of states, were deeply embedded in international law and practice. Mm-hmm. And should India simply march into East Pakistan, this would be viewed as another Indo-Pakistan conflict. It would be immediately ended. And the international community would lose all sympathy and support for the Bangladesh cause. This was no way to secure the recognition of Bangladesh as an independent state. So you had to proceed step by step, stage by stage. First, to build up the Bangladesh freedom fighters, their strength, their numbers, and to prepare the diplomatic grounds for intervention, to get international support for the Bangladesh cause, to justify, to explain the reasons why, unless the international community prevented Pakistan from carrying out these massacres and allowing the refugees to return home, India would have no option but to take measures on her own.
So one of the first things that you did, or India did at the time, was to create this little enclave in Kolkata called Mujibnagar, where senior Awami League personnel like Tajuddin. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, it wasn't an enclave exactly. It was two buildings on Theatre Road, what was then Theatre Road.
Shakespeare Sarani today.
Sarani in Kolkata. That's where they operated from, Mujibnagar, and there were a few other buildings here and there. Tajuddin Ahmed, who was the Prime Minister at that time, the acting Prime Minister, was a man of extraordinary dedication. He actually slept there, in his office.
You must have met him when you were in Dhaka later.
I did. He was a remarkable man. So also Osmani, who was the commander-in-chief of the Bangladesh forces there. He slept in a camp cot. Mm-hmm. These were men of extraordinary dedication and strength of purpose.
So what did they do in Mujibnagar? And
So what they did was, essentially, India did not recognize the Bangladesh government at that stage. It would have been counterproductive to have done so, but gave them every facility to operate from Indian soil. Their camps, etc., for the freedom fighters, assisted them with weapons, with training. We built up their strength, to huge numbers. There were ultimately about 100,000 freedom fighters who had been trained and equipped by the Indian Army.
This is by the end of November, just on the eve of the war that begins on the 3rd of December. In a sense, from March, 25th of March, when Operation Searchlight begins, and do you think that was like a tipping point when India realized that you had to come in? Or
that was the tipping point. But that's when we realized that we had to come in because, if there was an extended guerrilla conflict in the erstwhile East Pakistan, and guerrilla wars take years, before they achieve success, we thought that control of the movement of the guerrilla war would pass into the hands of extreme leftist elements, pro-Naxalite, pro-Chinese. Mm-hmm. And we mustn't forget that in early 1971, West Bengal was just just finished, dealing with more or less success with the Naxalite movement. It was a very serious problem at that time. We thought that the stability of our eastern states would be in serious danger as a consequence of the spillover of a prolonged guerrilla war, and also, of course, because of the exodus of refugees in in Tripura, the refugees actually outnumbered the host
Local
population. So the war had to be brought to an early conclusion. And what we intended was that by the end of the year, we'd help the freedom fighters, the Bangladesh freedom fighters, the Mukti Bahini, to build up their strength and to, have a very serious presence in that country, and then deliver a final blow in cooperation with the Mukti Bahini.
So when does India decide that you will train the Mukti Bahini?
This was in this was in April. In April, India formed, in outline, the elements of a grand strategy. This involved military measures, diplomatic measures, economic measures, other measures, connected with domestic policy. It wasn't just a decision to intervene militarily. Mm-hmm. It had to be supported. On the diplomatic side, we had to ensure that there would be a regular and uninterrupted supply of weapons, of military equipment, that oil supplies would not be cut off, that the Security Council would not bring the war to a premature conclusion before a decisive victory could be won. And this required the support of at least one superpower. Mm-hmm. And it was difficult to achieve all this because while the Bangladesh liberation struggle was going on, there was a revolution in diplomatic affairs with, this US-China breakthrough.
So tell us about that. So I wanted to bring you to that. So Nixon wants an opening into China. But tell us about how Kissinger comes to Delhi and then goes to Pakistan. Give us a flavor of what happened at the time.
So what happened was we had come to know from our own sources that moves were afoot for normalization of US-China relations. But we didn't think that it would take the dramatic form that it actually did, that what was in the offing was some sort of an Islamabad, Beijing, Washington axis, some sort of an entente, which might be directed against us. We thought it would be just normalization of relations, and we'd always supported recognition of the People's Republic of China as the proper legitimate government of China as a whole. Mm-hmm. So, we weren't concerned about this. And this is what Huxley conveyed in his discussions with Kissinger on his way out.
So then what happened?
And then what happened was that on the return, when we saw the Pakistan factor, because
so Kissinger comes to Delhi.
Kissinger comes to Delhi, then he goes to Pakistan.
And when he's in Delhi, he has good conversations with Indira Gandhi.
He has good conversations with our ministers in general.
And then from India, he goes to Pakistan.
And then from India, he goes to Pakistan, pretends that he has an upset stomach. And everybody thinks, well, this is standard for a visit to Delhi or Islamabad. But actually, he's secretly visiting Beijing, preparing the ground for.
So the Soviets, you of course didn't know, India didn't know, but even the Soviets didn't know.
No. The State Department didn't know, leave alone India and the Soviets. The State Department didn't know. The
Henry Kissinger
State was unaware of this move till the visit was done. So and then when he returned, he sent Kissinger, that is, he sent for L.K. Jha, our ambassador in Washington, and told him that India should not count on American understanding in the case of the Chinese, sort of moving on our border.
Why do you think he said that?
He said that, I think, because he wanted to deter Indian action. Perhaps because of that, I do not know, but this is what he said. And this, India reacted promptly to this by entering into the Treaty of friendship
peace
with
and
the
friendship.
Soviet Union. Yes.
So let me ask you this. The Treaty of Peace and Friendship with the Soviet Union that is signed in August of 1971, it seems from your book that the Soviets had been asking Mrs. Gandhi for some time, at least since 1969, to sign a treaty like that, but she was not very keen.
Well, what happened was this. Frankly, in the beginning, we sort of played the Soviets along. What happened was that the Soviet defense minister visited India in 1969, in early 69, shortly after, in fact, during this major clash between Soviet and Chinese forces on the Ussuri River border. And the Soviet defense minister proposed, that we conclude a treaty of peace, friendship, and cooperation. At that time, the Soviets were also trying to reach out to Pakistan to wean them away from China. And with this in mind, they had offered certain limited military supplies to Pakistan. And we wanted to wean the Russians away from this and to stop these supplies. And so we played along, we made it clear that, one of the conditions was that you wouldn't do this. And then by October, the Russians agreed. But at that stage, we told them that, look, there are reactionary elements, within the, in Parliament, etc., who wouldn't take kindly to this in India. So we'll do this shortly after, meaning after the elections, which were planned, as you know, in early 1969, and which gave Mrs. Gandhi a huge majority. So there were some in the Indian government who were, quite keen on signing a treaty even before August. People like D.P. Dhar, and by about May or so, even others like P.N. Haksar, the Foreign Secretary, T.N. Cole, etc. What happened was that once we decided to intervene in East Pakistan, there was this question of deterring the Chinese from making any military moves. And we thought that a Soviet, a treaty with the Soviet Union would serve this purpose. The idea, of course, was to intervene towards the end of the year when the Himalayan passes would be closed and any major Chinese move would not be feasible. But there was this question, what happens if China and Pakistan decide on preemptive action and attack us before that, sometime in, say, May or June or something like that. And therefore, there were voices in the government which wanted to conclude a treaty with the Russians at that time. And the Russians made it very clear that, they were prepared to sort of come to our help, but then we had to do the treaty. Mrs. Gandhi held out. Possibly because she discounted the Chinese, threat at that time, that she didn't think that they were likely to intervene, and also because she was really concerned about our non-aligned image. She changed her mind only after the conversation between L.K. Jha and Kissinger, which made it very clear that we could expect we would not expect a friendly White House, in the event of a conflict.
So tell me about this unfriendly White House. And, I asked you earlier about Nixon's unparliamentary or foul descriptions of Mrs. Gandhi. He called her all kinds of names, including that bitch and etc. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to say this because young children may be watching this interview, but having said that, it's in your book.
Right.
But what was Nixon's problem? Why was he so angry with Mrs. Gandhi?
Well, I think a plausible reason, one doesn't know for sure, it would require a political psychologist to analyze this complex personality. But I think one of the reasons was that whenever Nixon visited Pakistan, he was feted, he was lionized. In India, he received, all the honors which were due to him in protocol terms, but there wasn't much warmth beyond that, and certainly a great deal of fuss was not made over his sort of visit. Kissinger also suggests that Nixon was basically an insecure person, and Mrs. Gandhi somehow brought out his insecurities.
But you in your book, I think you've put Henry Kissinger in his place quite nicely.
Well, I think Kissinger was one of the most brilliant analysts, is one of the most brilliant analysts of international affairs in our time. He was also a hugely important statesman.
But somewhat economical with the truth.
Well, he was economical with the truth in his memoirs. Yes, I think there's a great deal of misrepresentation, perhaps deliberate, perhaps not.
What did he say?
We know it is misrepresentation because when we compare what he writes in his memoirs
Tell us about that.
with the record, and the record includes, in the case of the United States, not only written documents, but also very importantly, the tapes, of these White House tapes. So we have a very full record of his conversations with Nixon.
Tell us about that. About why Kissinger was so economical with the truth, or you use the word parsimonious.
Well, in his, you see, the basic theme, I think, in the section dealing with India, with the 1971 war, is that the aim of the United States was not really to prevent the emergence of Bangladesh as an independent state. Rather, it was to prevent India from overrunning West Pakistan and from breaking it up. Now, this is absolute nonsense, because if that had been the limited aim of the White House, Nixon and Kissinger, they could have accepted any of the Soviet resolutions in the Security Council, in the first few days of the war, which would have, brought about a ceasefire on the Western Front before India had made any major ingress there, and which at the same time would have been helpful to India and Bangladesh on the Eastern Front. Mm-hmm. So, the facts clearly belie this. There's no truth in this. If this had been his intention, then the war would have come to an end long before that.
So that was one. He thought that India wanted to break up Pakistan.
This is what he claims. And in this account, he actually distorts, the sense of some of these reports. For example, the Americans had an intelligence report, about India wanting to crush Pakistan armor. Uh-huh. Now, he makes this, to destroy the Pakistan armed forces. And he says if the Pakistan army is destroyed, Pakistan's unity also gets destroyed. Now, there's a huge difference between destruction of Pakistan armor, which only means that Pakistan will not have a major offensive capacity vis-a-vis India, and to say that we were aiming at the destruction of the Pakistan army as a whole. Mm-hmm. So, there are several misrepresentations like that, misrepresentations of fact.
You think he did it deliberately?
I think some of this may have been deliberate, some of it I do not know, maybe because he was himself confused. Even brilliant minds can be confused on occasion. I think he bungled this enterprise thing, for example.
Yes.
His handling was really very, very maladroit of that whole affair.
So this is the nuclear aircraft carrier USS Enterprise.
Absolutely.
That the Americans threatened to sail into the Bay of Bengal first, which it did not come into the Bay of Bengal, you say in your book.
It just skirted the southern edges.
But certainly into the Indian Ocean.
Absolutely, absolutely. The idea, you see, it arose from, as we know from the taped records of the Nixon-Kissinger conversations. first Nixon came up with this idea that we should tell the Chinese to move to the border. Very important to do so.
To the India-China border.
To the India-China border. And Kissinger at first was not very enthusiastic about this. You know, he'd visited China twice. On his first visit in May, he came back with the impression that the Chinese were more than ready to move against India. But on the second visit, in October, which followed the conclusion of the Indo-Soviet Treaty, he then reported to Nixon that, look, you know, now they seem to be worried about, Soviet countermeasures and they aren't going to move. So that's why he wasn't initially very enthusiastic about Nixon's proposal. But then he came up with a more elaborate proposal. And that was that, we can ask them to move and at the same time give them an assurance of American support by moving a carrier task fleet into the Indian Ocean. And so it was decided to send a task force under the Enterprise into the Indian Ocean. And the same day, Kissinger met secretly with Chinese ambassador Huang Hua. And
at a safe house in New York.
At a CIA safe house in New York, and told him that, this is what we've decided. And he offered to share intelligence about Soviet troop dispositions on the Chinese border. And he told him in very carefully chosen words that if China were to move and another country were to move against China, then the United States would, I forget the exact word he used, but would dissuade that country from moving against China. In other words, there was a signal of American support in the case of Chinese intervention, of Chinese pressure on the Sino-Russian border. And he hoped that this would encourage the Chinese, to move. It was a horrible miscalculation. It was a miscalculation, firstly, of Chinese policy. China was not seeking an American defense umbrella. It simply didn't want a situation where it had to confront two superpowers at the same time, simultaneously. And it wanted to make some progress on the Taiwan issue. But Chu Enlai made it very clear later in January to General Haig, who was deputy to Kissinger. He said that, no country should look to another country to ensure its security. If it does so, it becomes an underling of the other power. So
this whole American or the US tilt towards Pakistan is really about punishing Mrs. Gandhi.
Yes, it was not punishing Mrs. Gandhi, but certainly preventing her from, getting what she wanted, preventing India from, coming to the assistance of the Bangladeshis.
But it is fascinating that until, like you said, L.K. Jha has this conversation with Kissinger, Mrs. Gandhi was quite reluctant about getting into the Treaty of Peace and Friendship with the Soviets at the time.
She was reluctant. She held out.
So while this drama is unfolding across these months from March 1971 ultimately till December, over these 9 months, what's happening inside East Pakistan at the time? So Mujib is in jail. Mujib has been thrown into...
Yes, Mujib was, taken away to West Pakistan and incarcerated there. And later, he was subjected to a so-called trial. And there's a death sentence was passed and so on, though not actually carried out. And within Bangladesh itself, there was, savage repression which was unleashed. It was quite horrific. The massacre of, innocent people on a huge scale. As I said, 10 million refugees, being sent across the border. And in the latter part, of this liberation struggle, they particularly targeted the Hindu minority and drove them out, with the result that while the first lot of refugees, majority were Muslim, the second lot, a large majority were Hindus. And it made it imperative for the government of India to ensure communal peace and harmony, that there should be no misapprehension of this as some sort of a communal affair. That was a very, very important measure which the government took.
Right, and so then of course the war comes to an end on the 17th of December.
Yeah. 16th there's a surrender in Dhaka. The next day Yahya accepts a ceasefire on the Western Front and the wars come to an end.
So that must have been, that is probably an epochal event in South Asia's history.
Absolutely. I think it's the first and only time in the history of independent India that we formulated and executed a grand strategy.
And who would you give credit to?
Well, to many people, I think part of the credit, a large part of the credit goes to Mrs. Gandhi, as I said, for her leadership. But her principal policy advisors, they were primarily responsible for shaping policy, and particularly P.N. Haksar, but also, D.P. Dhar, the intelligence chief, R.N. Kao, T.N. Cole, the generals, Manik Shaw, and the generals in our Eastern Command, also in the Directorate of Military Operations. The credit goes to, the soldiers who fought the war, who put their lives at risk, to the gallant men who lost their lives for the cause. It goes to the millions of Indians, often very poor Indians, living in very strained circumstances, who offered hospitality and shelter on such generous terms, to the Bangladeshi refugees.
Right. Ambassador Dasgupta, I want to ask you, you've pored over the archives to write this book. So tell us a little bit about that, and tell me about the Shimla Agreement, because there's so many misconceptions about what happened in Shimla. And again, from the archives or from the records that you've seen and read.
Well, Shimla, it's sometimes said that India won the war but lost the peace.
Right.
Because India did not seize this opportunity to convert the line of actual control into an international border.
The line of control.
The line of control into an international border. I think this overlooks two facts. The first is that Kashmir was not the principal aim of the 1971 war. It's the only India-Pakistan war which had nothing to do with Kashmir or any objective on the Western Front. It was about the liberation of Bangladesh, and that strategic goal was achieved on the 16th December when Bangladesh stood liberated. The second thing to bear in mind is this, that during the war we adopted a sort of subsidiary aim, limited aim, and that was to get rid of the old line of actual control, LAC, which came into being in 1949 as a result of a UN Security Council resolution, and to substitute that by a bilaterally agreed line of control reflecting the ground realities after the 1971.
So the ceasefire line of 1949 becomes the line of control of 1972.
But this is not simply a question of some minor geographical changes,
right,
which might be of tactical advantage to India, of course. There's a larger issue involved, and that is shifting from multilateral fora to bilateral settlement for settlement of India-Pakistan.
So why did Mrs. Gandhi convert? I mean, she was, India had won the war, Pakistan had been broken up into two. Why didn't she just press her advantage and convert the line of control into a border?
Because she feared that had she done so, she would have been accused by the opposition in India to having surrendered Pakistan-occupied Kashmir.
So the POK...
This is what you did. You surrendered, you gave up the whole of POK. She didn't want that. But she wanted, as I said, to substitute this new line, to bring into being this new line of control. And she wanted this to gradually develop into, for all practical purposes, a border.
But we've seen, in hindsight, that was something that she could have done better.
In what way?
Well, the LOC could have been turned into a boundary despite her apprehensions at the time.
No, but that would be a major thing. You can't do this sort of a thing, and this is a huge sort of territorial question. You can't do this unless in the absence of a national consensus. And do you have a national consensus even today for a settlement on those lines?
Not really.
Well, you see, there you are. So it can't be done in one step, at one go. There has to be a process leading to that. And what Mrs. Gandhi was trying to do was to initiate movement in that direction. Now, I say this because this is clear from the records. I myself had no clear idea of what happened. But when one sees the record, in particular the draft agreement, every draft given by India reserves a final settlement of the Kashmir issue to a later date.
So all the stories that we've read and heard about that the recordings didn't work or something or the other didn't happen and Bhutto got the better of Indira Gandhi in Shimla.
Completely untrue. Completely untrue. We have a record, you see, when Bhutto emerged from his conversation with Indira Gandhi, the first person he met was his close aide Rafi Raza. And Rafi Raza has left an account of what Bhutto told him. Bhutto was extremely disturbed. He said, she doesn't trust me. And, that she's a hardliner, and so on and so forth. So it's totally different from the stories that we heard later. You've always to rely on the contemporary record, on what was said and what was written at that time, rather than the stories and anecdotes people make up later. And here, it's quite clear what actually transpired.
But she returned the 90,000 prisoners of war that India had taken.
Yes, of course. And India had no option but to do so, because the Geneva Convention on POWs requires that they be returned after a conflict without delay. And certainly, had we kept them back, for purpose of exerting political pressure, we would not only have invited international condemnation for violating this fundamental principle of international law, but also we would have lost the protection of the Geneva Conventions in any future conflict where Indian soldiers were taken as prisoners of war.
So last question to you, Ambassador Dasgupta. At the end of this war, what is Nixon's view of Mrs. Gandhi and what do the Americans think of India?
Well, what Americans think of India is very different from what Nixon thought of India or Mrs. Gandhi.
Right.
In the United States, there was wide public sympathy for the victims of the Pakistan, massacres, for the Bangladesh cause, for India, in the media, in Congress, even in the State Department. And one consequence of this was that there was, constant leakage of, internal documents critical of the White House, such as the famous blood telegram from Dhaka.
This is the U.S. Consul General in Dhaka, Archer Blood, whose telegram on the massacres in Bangladesh is again a...
And because of this, that enterprise lacked credibility. Mrs. Gandhi didn't take it very seriously as a threat because she realized that American public opinion would not have permitted its use against democratic forces there. When she gave that famous speech from the Red Fort on hearing about the enterprise, she sounded a note of defiance for the Indian public, and for the American audience, she also, said that the White House is telling us that this is because of they have treaty obligations with Pakistan. But I thought these treaty obligations were directed against a communist threat and not against democracy, not against injustice, not against oppression. These were words directed, because they have a resonance in US public opinion, and Nixon knew that he'd be flayed by US public opinion, and that's why the Enterprise was not ordered to sail towards Chittagong, but in the direction of Colombo.
I'll have to leave it there, but Ambassador Dasgupta, thank you so much for your time. And just to remind all of us, all the viewers, please do go buy the book and read the book at least. It's called India and the Bangladesh Liberation War.